A 20-year-old kid who hadn't eaten in 2 days found a wallet in a parking lot with $4,200 inside. Enough for a room. Enough for a bus ticket out. Enough to stop being invisible. He stood there for 11 minutes. And then he did something that would put him in the back of a police cruiser by nightfall. Because the man he was trying to find was wearing a Hells Angels patch. And the men in this town had already decided what a homeless kid was. What they didn't know was that 350 motorcycles were already turning onto Route 9. Before we go any further, I want to know who's riding with me tonight. Drop your city in the comments. Just the city, wherever you're watching from. Ohio, Texas, Georgia, Alberta, Manchester. I don't care how far out you are. Because what happened in Ravensburg only happened because a few hundred people who had never met that boy decided he was worth showing up for. That's the whole story. That's the only reason it ends the way it ends. Delbert Krause spent 8 months betting that nobody was watching. He was right about that for 8 months. Let's make sure he's wrong tonight. So tell me where you're from. Hit subscribe if you believe an honest man shouldn't be punished for being honest. And stay with me, because this one takes a turn about 20 minutes in that you are not going to see coming. Now, to understand what happened in Ravensburg, Ohio, in the fall of that year, you have to understand 3 people who had no business ever meeting. To understand what happened in Ravensburg, Ohio, in the fall of that year, you have to understand 3 people who had no business ever meeting. The first was a 20-year-old named Wendell Pike, who slept behind a laundromat on Hollis Street because the vent there blew warm air until 9 o'clock at night, and because nobody looked in that alley. The second was a 61-year-old man called Otis Vandegrift, who had ridden with the Hells Angels for 34 years and carried something in his wallet that mattered more to him than his own life. And the third was a man named Delbert Krause, who owned the building the laundromat sat in, and the building beside it, and most of the block behind it. He had never spoken a word to either of the other 2. He would decide what happened to both of them. The alley behind the Hollis Street laundromat is 11 feet wide and runs 40 yards between 2 brick buildings that were put up before the First World War. There is a dumpster at the far end that gets emptied on Tuesdays. There is a drain pipe that has been broken since sometime in the 90s, and about 2/3 of the way down, set into the wall at about the height of a man's shoulder, there is a dryer vent. Wendell Pike could tell you exactly what time that vent shut off. 9 o'clock, most nights. Sometimes 8:40, if the last customer finished early. On Sundays, it was closer to 7, and Sundays were the hardest nights of the week, for reasons that had nothing to do with God. He had found the spot in March. He had learned it the way you learn a house you grew up in, where the wind came from, which brick was loose, which car alarm on 5th Street went off at 2 in the morning for no reason at all. He kept a milk crate down there, turned upside down, wedged between the dumpster and the wall so that anyone walking past would read it as garbage rather than furniture. He sat on that crate every night with his back against the warm brick and his knees pulled up, and he waited for the vent to stop. Every morning, before the sun came up properly, he did the same thing. He took the cardboard he slept on, 2 flattened appliance boxes he'd carried 8 blocks from behind a hardware store, and he folded them down, and he slid them behind the dumpster, and he stacked a broken pallet in front of them. It took him about 4 minutes. He did it every single morning for 8 months. He did it because the moment somebody knows you're sleeping in their alley, you stop being able to sleep in their alley. He'd learned that in his 2nd week. So he made himself invisible on purpose and got very, very good at it. That was not a thing his grandmother would have wanted for him. Odessa Pike raised Wendell in a 2-bedroom rental on the north end of town from the time he was 4 years old, which was the year his mother left and did not come back. She worked 26 years for the county school district, mostly in kitchens, and she had a set of rules about the world that she repeated so often they wore grooves into the boy. You say thank you the first time, and you mean it. You don't take the last of anything, and if you find something that isn't yours, you find who it belongs to. He was maybe 9 years old the first time he tested that last one. He came home from school with a $5 bill he'd picked up off the sidewalk outside the Sunoco, holding it out to her like a trophy, already talking about what he was going to spend it on. She didn't scold him. She never really scolded. She just sat down at the kitchen table so she was eye level with him, and she took his hand, the one with the money in it, and she closed his fingers around it and held them shut. "What you find isn't yours, baby," she said. "It's just resting in your hands." And then she walked him back to the Sunoco, and they stood in that parking lot for 40 minutes, asking every single person who came out if they'd lost $5. Nobody had. She let him keep it, but she made him earn the keeping of it by standing out there in the cold for 40 minutes first, and he never forgot the difference between those two things. Odessa Pike died on a Tuesday in January, in a hospital bed in Ravensburg County Medical, of a stroke that took her in about 90 seconds. Wendell was 19. He was in his second semester at the community college, studying diesel mechanics, and he had $140 in a checking account. The rental was in her name. It had always been in her name. Wendell had lived in that house for 15 years, and there was not one piece of paper anywhere in the world that said he had a right to be in it. The property management company sent a letter 9 days after the funeral. It was not cruel. That's the thing people get wrong about how this happens. Nobody was cruel. The letter was polite and printed on good paper, and it explained that the tenant of record was deceased and that the unit would need to be vacated. There was a phone number at the bottom. Wendell called it 4 times. Twice nobody answered, and twice he got a woman who was kind to him and could not do anything. Kraus Property Group changed the locks 11 days later. He stayed with a friend from the college for a while, and then with the friend's cousin, and then in a shelter over in Marysburg until the beds ran out. And then he stopped telling people where he was staying, because the answer had gotten embarrassing. By March, he was behind the laundromat. But he kept a schedule. That mattered to him more than he could have explained to anybody. 10 in the morning to 4 in the afternoon, he was at the Ravensburg Public Library, a low brown building with good heat and clean bathrooms, and a librarian named Miss Fentress, who had figured out what was going on by the second week, and never once said a word about it. It was warm. It was free. Nobody asked you anything. He used the computers to apply for work. He was good at it, actually. He wrote careful cover letters. He checked his spelling twice. He knew how to talk about the diesel program, even though he hadn't finished it. What he did not have was an address, and there is no polite way to explain on an application form that you can be reached at a library terminal between the hours of 10 and 4. He'd been rejected from 11 jobs that month. The 12th application was still open on the library computer, unsent. He'd come back to it on Thursday. He would never get the chance. Delbert Kraus bought the Hollis Street block in September for a little under $400,000. 4 buildings, 2 of them half empty, and the alley that ran between them. He called it a revitalization. That word appeared in the local paper and on a rendering he had printed and mounted on foam board for the county planning meeting. A drawing of that same street, with new awnings and young trees and people walking dogs. The plan had a budget, and the budget had line items, and one of those line items was labeled site preparation. Site preparation, in the ordinary sense, means clearing debris, removing what is already there so that something else can be built. In this particular budget, on this particular block, it also meant the 4 people who slept in that alley. Kraus did not use the word people. He never once used the word people. He hired a private security firm out of Columbus, a 2-man contract, overnight and early morning. And on a Thursday in the second week of October, at 5 o'clock in the morning, in the dark, a pressure washer was run down the full length of that alley. Wendell woke to the noise of it. He got maybe 90 seconds. Enough to get on his feet, enough to get out of the way. Not enough for anything else. Everything behind the dumpster went into the dumpster. The cardboard. A blanket he'd bought for $4 at a church sale. A canvas bag with a change of clothes in it, a toothbrush, a spiral notebook, and, in a plastic sleeve at the bottom of that bag, one photograph of Odessa Pike standing on the front steps of a house on the north end of town, squinting into the sun, laughing at whoever was holding the camera. It was the only picture of her he had. He came back at 7. He was not angry. Everyone who has told this story since has agreed on that detail. He was not angry. He was polite. He said, "Excuse me." He found one of the security men standing by a truck at the mouth of the alley, and he explained that there had been a bag, and that there was a photograph in the bag, and that he only wanted the photograph, and that they could keep everything else. The man told him the dumpster had already been emptied. That was true. The truck had come at 6:15. Wendell asked where it went. The man said he didn't know. That was also true. And parked across the street, in a gray sedan with the engine running, Delbert Kraus watched the entire conversation through a closed window. He was 40 feet away. He did not get out. He did not roll the window down. When it was finished, he pulled out onto Hollis Street and drove to a 9 o'clock meeting. I want to stop here for a second, because this is the part people always ask about. Delbert Kraus did not break a single law that morning. He owned the property. He was entitled to clean it. There is no statute in the state of Ohio requiring a man to sort through a bag before he throws it away, and no court anywhere that would have made him give back that photograph because in the eyes of the law, that photograph was garbage on private land. Everything he did was legal. That's what makes it worse. There's a certain kind of man who never has to get his own hands dirty. He signs a form, he makes a phone call, and somebody else throws a dead woman's photograph into a dumpster. If you've had enough of men like Delbert Krause winning, hit that subscribe button right now. Men like him are counting on you not paying attention. Let's prove them wrong. And type "I'm paying attention" in the comments so he knows exactly how many of us there are. Wendell stood at the mouth of that alley for a while after the truck pulled away. He didn't shout. He didn't put his hands on anybody. He didn't say one word about it to a single person, that day or any day afterward. He just started walking, east, because the library didn't open until 10, and because the wind had picked up, and because he needed to be somewhere that had chairs. He wasn't looking for revenge. He was looking for somewhere to sit down. The library closed early that day. Some kind of staff training. A sign taped to the inside of the glass. Wendell stood in front of it for a minute, reading it twice, the way you do when you're hoping the words will rearrange themselves. So he walked. That is what you do when you have nowhere to be and no way to sit down. He walked the long loop, down 5th, past the Sunoco where he had once stood in the cold for 40 minutes, asking strangers about $5, over to the county building, back around. By 20 minutes to 5, the light had gone flat and gray, and the rain had started. Not hard. The kind that doesn't fall so much as hang in the air and slowly find its way into everything you own. The parking lot behind Hollis Street was mostly empty by then. 9 or 10 cars. Cracked asphalt with weeds coming up through the seams, a chain-link fence along the back, one sodium light that came on too early and buzzed. He cut through it because it was faster, and because the awning on the far side would give him 30 feet of dry. That is when he saw the wallet. It was maybe 6 feet in front of him, lying flat and slightly open near the painted line of an empty space. Brown leather, worn pale at the corners and the fold. The kind of wallet a man has carried for 15 or 20 years. Rain was already darkening the surface of it. Wendell stopped walking. He did not pick it up, not for 40 seconds. And I want you to sit inside those 40 seconds with me, because everything that happens in this story comes out of them. For the first several, he simply looked. Not at the wallet, around it. He checked the lot. He checked the windows of the buildings above it. He looked at the sodium light, and at the corner where 5th meets Hollis, and he found the security camera bolted to the brick there, the one that pointed down into the lot, because a young man who sleeps outside in a town that does not want him learns very quickly where the cameras are and what they are for. Then he looked at his own hands. They were wet. He was wearing a jacket that was not warm enough and a pair of boots that were a size and a half too big, that he had been given at a shelter in Marysburg in February, that had rubbed the skin off both his heels twice and healed over twice. He was 20 years old. He had not eaten since a bagel somebody left on a library table the previous afternoon. He had, that morning, watched the last photograph of his grandmother go into a garbage truck, and there was a wallet lying in front of him in the rain. Nobody knows what he was thinking. He has never fully explained it, and I am not going to invent it for you. What we know is that he stood there in the rain for 40 seconds, and then he bent down and picked it up. Inside, in a tight fold that had shaped itself to the leather over years, was $4,200 in cash. Hundreds mostly, some 50s. He counted it twice standing up, and then a third time. Now, let me do the arithmetic that Wendell Pike was doing, because if you have never been broke in the specific way that he was broke, you might not understand how loud that money was. A deposit on a one-bedroom in Ravensburg that fall ran about $500. First month's rent, another $500. That is $1,000, and a set of keys, and an address. An actual address. The thing that had been standing between him and every job he'd applied for since March. A bus ticket to Toledo, where he had an aunt he had not spoken to in 2 years because he was ashamed, was $31. Groceries for one person, eating carefully, ran maybe $200 a month. $4,200 was a roof, and a bus ticket, and 4 months of food, and enough left over to buy a pair of boots that actually fit his feet. It was not a fantasy. It was not a windfall. It was the exact and precise cost of climbing back out of the hole he had been living in for 8 months, and it was sitting in his hand. He kept looking through the wallet. Behind the cash was a clear plastic sleeve. In it was a photograph. A man and a boy on a wooden fishing dock, The man younger than he'd be now, the boy maybe 11 or 12, both of them holding up the same fish between them, and both of them laughing about it. And folded behind that photograph, soft at the creases from being opened and refolded a great many times, was a laminated funeral card. Wendell read the name on it. He read the 2 dates on it, and did the subtraction, and got 22 years. Then he sat down on the concrete curb at the edge of that parking lot, in the rain, with a stranger's $4,000 in one hand, and a stranger's dead son in the other, and he stayed there a long time. Here is what I believe he was hearing. What you find isn't yours, baby. It's just resting in your hands. He put the money back. Not most of it, all of it. $4,200. Folded exactly the way he'd found it, pressed back into the same worn crease. Then he went looking for a name. The license was in the front sleeve, behind a cracked plastic window. Otis Vandegrift. There was an address under it, 3 miles east, on the far side of the rail crossing. Wendell knew the street. Everybody in Ravensburg knew that street. It was the kind of place people in that town described by what was parked outside it, and the thing parked outside it was 40 motorcycles, and the men who rode them wore a patch that this entire county had spent 30 years learning not to look directly at. He had $4,000 in his pocket, no shoes that fit, and 3 miles to walk. Every person he'd ask for directions that night would tell him the same thing. Don't. Turn around. That is not a place where a kid like you comes back from. 3 miles, walked slowly, in wet boots, is about an hour and 10 minutes. Wendell went east along Hollis until the sidewalk ran out, and then along the shoulder of Route 9, past the tire shop, and the shuttered feed store, and the long, dark stretch where the streetlights stop. He kept his right hand in his jacket pocket the whole way, closed around the wallet, because he had already thought through what it would look like if somebody stopped him. A young man who sleeps outside, at night, in the rain, with $4,200 in his coat. He knew exactly how that story would be told if it got told by anyone but him. He asked directions twice. A woman closing up a nail salon on 5th pointed east and then said, carefully, that he ought to think about it. A man filling a truck at the marathon station told him flat out to turn around. Neither of them asked why he was going. In Ravensburg, you did not need to ask why somebody was going to that street. You only needed to tell them not to. 11 miles away, at roughly the same hour, a 61-year-old man was taking his kitchen apart. Otis Vandegrift had noticed the wallet was gone at about 5:15, and by 6 he had emptied both saddlebags onto a workbench, pulled the cushions off a couch, gone through a truck twice, and driven back to the hardware store, where he'd bought a length of chain that afternoon. He was not looking for the cash. I want to be clear about that, because it matters to everything that follows. $4,000 was a substantial amount of money to him, and he barely thought about it. He was looking for a photograph of a boy on a fishing dock, and a funeral card, and there was not another copy of either of them anywhere in the world. His son had been 22. That is all I'm going to say about it for now, because Otis himself would not say much more than that for another 11 years. At 6:40 he made a phone call. By 7, 6 men were out retracing his day: the hardware store, a diner, a parts counter, 2 gas stations, the parking lot behind Hollis Street. They went in pairs, they asked politely, and every one of them had been told the same thing when the call came in. Not for the cash, for the picture. Now I want to stop and be honest with you about something, because this story does not work if I'm not. The Hells Angels are a motorcycle club with a criminal history. That is not slander, and it is not a rumor. There are convictions on the record in multiple countries, and the reason a town of 11,000 people learns not to look directly at that patch is not because of a misunderstanding. The fear is not manufactured. It was earned, over decades, by real men doing real things. And at the same time, and both of these are true, a patch is not a personality. What that death's head means in a federal indictment, and what it means on a Tuesday night in a bar in eastern Ohio, are not always the same thing. The Ohio Valley Charter in that year was 31 men. Some of them had been to prison. Most of them had jobs: a welder, 2 truck drivers, a man who ran a small engine repair shop, a retired Navy corpsman. Their charter president was 61 years old, with a knee that had been rebuilt twice, and on that particular night, he had 6 men driving around a county in the rain, looking for a picture of a dead boy. The town's fear of them was not wrong. It was just incomplete, and it was about to become the single most dangerous thing in Wendell Pike's life. Not because of what those men were, but because of what everybody else assumed they were. The Iron Kettle sits on the east side of the rail crossing, a low cinder block building painted a brown, that used to be a different brown, with a metal door and 2 windows that have been covered from the inside for as long as anyone can remember. Wendell came up on it a little after 7:30. He heard it before he saw it. That particular sound of 40 bikes parked and cooling, the ticking of hot metal, and under it music through a wall. He stopped at the edge of the lot, and he stood there for 6 minutes. There were people inside who watched him do it, and they have all described it the same way. A kid in a soaked jacket, standing perfectly still at the far edge of the gravel, just past the reach of the light. Not approaching, not leaving. 6 minutes is a long time. It is long enough for a man to change his mind 4 times and change it back. What he was weighing was not complicated. He was weighing the fact that he had $4,200 of another man's money in his pocket, and that he was about to walk into a building where every single person would be able to see that he did not belong, and that if one man in that room decided the story was that he had stolen it, there was nothing on God's earth that Wendell Pike could say to make it be otherwise. He walked in anyway. Here is what a room does when someone like him comes through a door like that. The music kept playing. Everything else stopped. The Iron Kettle on a Thursday night was maybe 40 people. Leather and denim. Most of it patched, some of it not. Men in their 50s and 60s, a few younger. 3 or 4 women. Pool table in the back that went quiet mid-shot, and every head in that building turned, and every one of them took the same 3/4 of a second to read him. They saw a young man about 6 feet tall who could not have weighed 150 pounds. They saw a jacket holding water. They saw boots a size and a half too big. The laces knotted where they'd broken and been retied, the toe of the left one separating from the sole. They saw a face that had not been shaved in a while by a person who could not really grow a beard yet. And they smelled him. There is no gentle way to put this, and it matters, so I'm going to say it. A person living in an alley behind a laundromat for 8 months carries that with him into a warm room, and everyone in the Iron Kettle knew within 2 seconds exactly what they were looking at. The bartender was a woman named Hollis, 62 years old, who had worked behind that bar for 19 years and did not need anybody's help handling a room. She came down off her stool, and she said, not cruelly, but with the flatness of a woman who has said it 1,000 times, "You can't be in here." Out! Wendell did not argue. He raised his right hand, and in it was a brown leather wallet, worn pale at the corners, and he said one sentence. "I'm looking for Otis Vandegrift. I think this is his." I have thought a great deal about that sentence. There is no version of it that is safe. He could have left the wallet on the doorstep. He could have handed it to Corliss and walked. He could have mailed it. Instead, he stood in the middle of a room full of strangers and identified himself, out loud, as the person in possession of it. Corliss went in the back. Otis came out about 20 seconds later, wiping his hands on a rag, and he crossed that floor and took the wallet out of the kid's hand without a word. And then he counted the money. I want you to understand what that was. It was not suspicion, exactly. It was 34 years of a certain kind of life, and a hand that moved before the head could catch up. He opened it in front of 40 people, and he thumbed through $4,200 in cash, hundreds and fifties, standing 3 feet from a starving 20-year-old. Nobody in that room said anything. Nobody breathed. Wendell stood there with his arms at his sides and let a man count money in his face, and did not say one word in his own defense, because there was not one thing he could have said that would have helped. The count came out right, all of it. And Otis Vandegrift did not look at that cash again for the rest of his life. He opened the other side, the clear plastic sleeve, the one behind the fold, and there was a photograph of a man and a boy on a wooden fishing dock, holding the same fish between them, both of them laughing. The people who were in the Iron Kettle that night have described what happened next in almost identical language, which is unusual, and which is how I know it's true. His hand started shaking. A 61-year-old man, the president of that charter, a man who had done things in his life that this town told stories about, stood in the middle of his own bar, holding a photograph in 2 hands that would not hold still. Then he sat down on the nearest stool, and he did not say anything at all for a while, and 40 people looked at the floor and let him have it. When he could talk again, the first thing he did was take the cash out, the whole fold, all $4,200, and hold it out to the kid. Wendell put his hands behind his back. Actually did that, physically, like a child refusing something hot. "It's not mine," he said. Otis looked at him for a long moment. Then he said, "Then, let me buy you dinner." There was a kitchen in the back of the iron kettle that made about 4 things. Wendell Pike sat down at a table with a cheeseburger and a plate of fries and a Coke, at a table full of Hell's Angels, and ate the first hot meal he'd had in 9 days. Corliss brought him a second one without being asked, and without saying anything about it. Somewhere in there, Otis asked him where he was staying. Wendell lied. He said he had a place. That lie would cost him 3 weeks of his life. 2 days later, at 11:15 in the morning, Wendell Pike was arrested on the front steps of the Ravensburg Public Library. He was carrying a plastic bag with a sandwich in it. He had walked the 8 blocks from the alley, the way he did every morning, and he was 4 minutes from a warm room, and a computer terminal, and a job application he had been rewriting in his head for 2 days. The charges were grand theft and receiving stolen property, a felony and a misdemeanor. The felony carried, in the state of Ohio at that time, a potential sentence of up to 18 months. Here is how it was built. Somebody had made a call. The report, when it was finally produced in court, described a concerned citizen who had observed a homeless male in the vicinity of the Hollis Street parking lot in possession of a large quantity of cash. The figure given was approximately $4,000, and who was concerned that this individual may have obtained it unlawfully. That is a remarkable sentence when you take it apart. Somebody knew the amount. Not a lot of money, not a roll of bills. Approximately $4,000, which is what you say when you already know the number is 4,200. The report was taken by a Ravensburg police officer named Cyril Bond, 44 years old, 11 years on the department. Bond worked security details on the side. One of the firms he'd worked for had a contract on the Hollis Street block. I'm going to leave that there for the moment, because at this stage in the story, nobody in Ravensburg had put those 2 facts next to each other, and I don't want to get ahead of it. Officer Bond wrote the report, pulled the security footage from the camera at 5th and Hollis, made the arrest himself, and did not, at any point in those 2 days, contact Otis Vandegrift. Think about that. There is a man whose name is on the license inside that wallet. He lives 11 miles away. He has a phone. He would have answered it. Nobody called him. And then there was the video. The camera at 5th and Hollis is mounted high on the brick, angled down and away, and what it captured that afternoon was 11 minutes of grainy footage from behind and above. It shows a young man walk into the lot. It shows him stop. It shows him stand there. It shows him bend down, pick something up, and then remain in that lot, alone, in the rain, for 11 minutes, standing, then sitting on a curb, then standing again, before finally walking east and out of frame. From that angle you cannot see his hands. You cannot see his face. You cannot see the money go back into the fold. You cannot see the photograph, or the funeral card, or a 20-year-old kid reading 2 dates and doing the subtraction. All you can see is a homeless man, alone, with something that isn't his, for 11 minutes. The county prosecutor's office looked at that footage and saw hesitation, and hesitation, they would argue, is deliberation. A man who takes 11 minutes to decide is a man who was deciding. Wendell was booked into the county holding facility that afternoon. Bond was accurate on the paperwork, and the paperwork is the whole problem. Under permanent address, he wrote homeless. Under telephone, he wrote none. Under emergency contact, he wrote none. Every one of those was true. Wendell's grandmother was dead. His mother had not been heard from in 16 years. His aunt in Toledo did not have a phone number for him, and he did not have one for her. The friend from the community college had moved to Cincinnati in June. Bail was set at a hearing he attended by video link, wearing a county jumpsuit, without counsel present, in a proceeding that lasted under 4 minutes. And then a 20-year-old with no lawyer, no address, no phone, and no family disappeared into a county system that is not designed to notice. Nobody knew where he was. That is the part I need you to hold on to. Not nobody cared, nobody knew. There was no phone that would ring unanswered. No apartment where mail would pile up. No coworker who'd say he didn't show. The single fact that Delbert Krause had spent 8 months engineering, that Wendell Pike was invisible, was the fact that made all of this possible. Otis Vandegrift went looking for him on the 4th day. He had thought about that kid every day since the Iron Kettle. He'd gotten it into his head to offer him work. There was a member of the charter with a machine shop who needed somebody to sweep and haul and learn. So on Monday morning, Otis rode into town. He'd been told the kid had a place. He didn't have an address, so he did the only thing he could think of, which was ask. He went to the library. Miss Fentress had not seen Wendell in 4 days, and she said it in a way that told Otis she'd noticed and had been worrying about it. He asked around Hollis Street, and eventually, somebody told him about the alley behind the laundromat. Otis walked down that alley on a Monday afternoon, 11 feet wide, 40 yards long, clean concrete, washed pail, a dumpster, a broken drain pipe, a dryer vent set into the brick at shoulder height. Nothing else, not a milk crate, not a scrap of cardboard, not one single thing to prove that a human being had lived there for 8 months. He stood in that empty alley for a long time and understood 2 things at once: that the kid had lied to him, and why. Now understand what happened here. A young man did the single most honest thing available to him. He was starving. He was soaked. He had lost the last photograph of the woman who raised him that same morning, and he had $4,200 in his hand, and he gave it back. All of it. He walked 3 miles in the dark through a part of town everyone told him not to go, to hand it to a stranger, and then he refused a reward. And that act, that exact act, was turned into the evidence against him. Not because anybody in that building genuinely believed he was a thief. Read the report again. Nobody called Otis Vandegrift because nobody wanted the answer, because Delbert Krause needed that block cleared, and a kid with a felony charge is a kid who can be told to leave town. I need to know something before we go any further. If you believe a man should not be punished for doing the right thing, comment the words, "He gave it back." Just those 3 words. Krause spent a lot of money and a lot of years making sure that nobody was watching Wendell Pike. Let's make sure somebody's watching now. And if you're the kind of person who thinks the guy in the nice car shouldn't get to decide who sleeps outside, you already know where the subscribe button is. Wendell Pike sat in a county holding cell for 19 days before anyone came for him. And the person who finally did was not a lawyer. They looked for 19 days. It started with 4 men, and by the end of the first week, it was the whole charter. 31 people working a county of 11,000, with nothing to go on but a first name and a description. Otis had never gotten a last name. He had Wendell, and 20 years old, and boots too big, and that was the entire file. They went to the shelters first. Ravensburg had one, a 12-bed operation in a church basement, and the man who ran it recognized the description immediately and had not seen him since spring. Marysburg had a larger one and a record of a stay in February, but no forwarding anything, because there is never a forwarding anything. They went to the food bank and the 2 soup kitchens and the free clinic. They went back to the library twice. Miss Fentress made a phone call to a county caseworker on their behalf, which was more than she was strictly supposed to do. Then they started calling hospitals. Ravensburg County Medical, then the 2 in Marysburg, then the trauma center in Columbus. This is what you do on day 8, when you are looking for a young man who sleeps outside, and the nights have started dropping below 40 degrees. On day 11, Otis Vandegrift walked into the county coroner's office and asked whether they had received any unidentified white males, approximately 20 years of age, in the previous 2 weeks. They had not. He said thank you, and he went out to the parking lot, and he sat on his bike for about 10 minutes before he started it. It was Corliss who found him. Not in a shelter, not in a hospital. She was 62 years old. She had worked behind that bar for 19 years, and she had a laptop and a habit of doing crossword puzzles online after close. On the 18th night, sometime after 1 in the morning, she pulled up the Ravensburg County Clerk of Court's public docket, which is free and open to anybody, and had been sitting there the entire time, and she typed the only word she had: Wendell Pike, Wendell R. Grand theft, F5. Receiving stolen property, M1. Filed 19 days earlier. She called Otis at 1:40 in the morning. He answered on the second ring because he had been sleeping with the phone on his chest for 2.5 weeks. He was at the county jail when it opened. And this is where the thing stops being an accident. Otis Vandegrift went to that window with cash in a bank envelope, prepared to post bond on a 20-year-old first-time defendant charged with a 5th-degree felony property crime. In that county, in that year, the standard bond on a charge like that ran somewhere between $1,000 and $5,000. Half the time on a first offense, it was a personal recognizance release and a court date. The bond on Wendell Pike was set at $25,000. $25,000. On a homeless kid with no record, no vehicle, no passport, and no possible means of leaving the county. There is no legal theory under which that number makes sense. Bail exists to guarantee appearance. There was nothing in the world Wendell Pike was less capable of than running away. That number was not set to guarantee an appearance. That number was set to keep a man in a cell. Otis paid it, in cash, that morning, from a charter that took up a collection in under 12 hours. But he walked out of that building knowing that somebody had gone to deliberate trouble, and he wanted to know who and why. That is when he handed it to Doc. Manuela Faraday was the road captain of the Ohio Valley Charter, 53 years old, and everyone called her Doc because she'd spent 11 years as a Navy hospital corpsman before she'd ever sat on a motorcycle. She had a very particular set of skills for a very unglamorous kind of work. She read paperwork. Insurance forms, VA claims, court filings. She was the person the charter went to when something on a page didn't add up. Doc Faraday went to the county recorder's office, which, again, is public and open and free, and she started pulling property records on the Hollis Street block. She wanted to know who owned the parking lot with the camera on it and who employed the man who wrote the report. She found Kraus Property Group in about 40 minutes. 4 parcels, purchased in September. That much was already in the newspaper. Then, because she was thorough, she ran the company name backward through 8 years of filings. And she found an eviction. North end of Ravensburg, 2-bedroom rental. Tenant of record deceased. In January. Occupant with no leasehold interest removed. Locks changed. 11 days after the notice was posted. Kraus Property Group. You may have noticed something back at the beginning of this story. Wendell's landlord had a name. It was printed on good paper, at the top of a polite letter, and it was on the eviction notice taped to that door. It was the same name. I need you to sit with the shape of this, because it is not a coincidence, and it is not bad luck. Delbert Kraus owned the house that Wendell Pike grew up in. When the woman who raised him died, Kraus's company put him on the street, legally, politely, in 11 days. 8 months later, Kraus bought the block that the boy he'd evicted was now sleeping on, and he had that alley power washed at 5 in the morning, and a dead woman's photograph thrown into a garbage truck. And 2 days after that, when that same boy did the most honest thing a starving person can do, a report was filed with an oddly specific dollar figure in it, taken by an officer who had worked security for Kraus's contractor, and a bond was set at a number designed to make sure he stayed exactly where he was. Kraus made him homeless. Then he had him arrested for being homeless. Then he used the arrest to clear him off a block he intended to sell. 3 separate times, over 8 months, the same man reached into that kid's life. And Wendell Pike never knew his name. Otis Vandegrift made 1 phone call that night. He did not call a lawyer. He called every charter president between Cleveland and Louisville. There is a way. Information moves through that world that has nothing to do with the internet. No email. No group chat. No post that anybody could screenshot. It moves the way it has moved for 60 years. One man calls another man, tells him the whole thing start to finish, and then that man makes 4 calls of his own. It is slower than a text message, and it is very much harder to stop. Because at every link in the chain, there is a person who has heard the story out of a human mouth and decided for himself what he thinks about it. Otis Vandegrift told it plainly. He did not embellish. Kid found my wallet. $4,200 in it. And my boy's picture. Walked 3 miles in the rain to give it back and wouldn't take a dime. Now he's got a felony on him and a $25,000 bond. And the man who put him on the street in the first place is the man who owns the block. That was the whole pitch. He never once asked anybody to come. Cleveland heard it on a Tuesday night. Toledo and Akron by Wednesday. Then Cincinnati. Then Louisville. Then across the river into Indiana. By Thursday it was in Pittsburgh and coming down out of West Virginia. And by Friday, it had jumped the fence entirely. Because a story like that does not stay inside one club. The independents picked it up. Small clubs with 12 members and a clubhouse in somebody's pole barn. Clubs that in the ordinary course of things did not particularly care for the Hells Angels and did not pretend otherwise. 2 separate veterans riding organizations, one of them out of Dayton, whose members had never sat down at a table with a patched man in their lives. A women's club, out of Cincinnati, 11 riders, who heard the story secondhand, and called Doc Faraday directly to ask what time. And here is the thing that I still find remarkable, and that I want to say clearly. Not one of these people had ever met Wendell Pike. Not one of them could have picked him out of a room. They were not riding for a friend. They were riding because somewhere in a county they'd never been to, a starving 20-year-old had walked 3 miles in the rain to give back money he desperately needed, and had been put in a cell for it by a man in a nice car. Otis had expected 40. That was his honest number. His own charter and whoever else could get free. By the middle of the week, the count Doc was keeping had passed 90. By Saturday, it was over 200. By the night before the hearing, 350 motorcycles were staged at 4 separate meeting points along Route 9 and the county roads feeding into it. They rolled at 6 in the morning. If you have never heard 350 motorcycles moving together, I don't think I can fully give it to you. It does not sound like traffic. It sounds like weather. It arrives before it appears. A low pressure in the chest, felt in the sternum and the teeth a good half a minute before you can see a single headlight, so that people who were nowhere near the road looked up anyway and wondered what was coming. In Ravensburg, on a Monday morning in late October, the windows of the diner on Main began to rattle in their frames. The waitress there has said she thought it was a train, except that the trains do not come through until 8. Then the light came around the bend. Not one headlight, but a river of them, 4 blocks long, filling both lanes and running back past the tire shop and the shuttered feed store and out of sight. A town of 11,000 people came out onto the sidewalks in their coats over their pajamas and watched 350 motorcycles come up Main Street and fill it end to end, curb to curb, all the way to the courthouse steps. And then, near enough to all at once, they shut the engines off. And then, silence. The kind of silence that only comes after that much noise. A ringing, physical, enormous quiet, with 350 engines ticking as they cooled. 350 men and women stood outside the Ravensburg County Courthouse and did not say a single word. Courtroom 2 of the Ravensburg County Courthouse seats 91 people. It was built in 1953 for a different kind of proceeding. Oak benches, a low ceiling, brass fixtures, the whole architecture of a room designed to make ordinary people feel small and quiet. On an average Monday, it holds 11 or 12. Family members, a defendant's mother, somebody waiting on a different case. That morning, every seat was full by 7:40, and there were another 60 people standing along the back wall and out into the corridor, and a bailiff who had worked that building for 22 years had to go find the fire marshal because there was no procedure for what was happening. Leather in a room built for suits. Cut denim and patched vests and gray beards, a Navy corpsman's pin, a woman from Cincinnati with 11 riders behind her, 2 veterans organizations in colors that had nothing to do with each other, and 31 members of a charter out of the Ohio Valley sitting in the first 3 rows because they had gotten there first. Not one person spoke above a whisper. Somebody in the back had gone around before the judge came in and told everybody the same thing. We are guests in this room, and the second we act otherwise, that kid loses. Wendell Pike came in at 8:50 in a shirt and tie that did not belong to him, and he did not understand what he was looking at. He had been in a cell for 19 days and out of it for 4, and he had been told that some people were going to come. He turned around at the defense table and looked at that gallery and had to be told twice to sit down. The prosecution went first, and it took 40 minutes, and it was competent. The state's theory was simple, and it was ugly precisely because it was reasonable on its face. A man with nothing found $4,200. He was in a position of extreme need, and rather than immediately taking it to a police station, which is what the statute contemplates, and which is what an innocent person does, he retained it, alone, for 11 minutes, and then he carried it 3 miles across town. And here is the footage. They dimmed the lights and they played all 11 minutes of it. Not a clip. The whole thing, in real time, in that silent room. Grainy, high angle, from behind and above. A young man walks into frame. He stops. He stands. You cannot see his hands, and you cannot see his face. He bends. He picks something up, and then he stays, standing, then sitting on the curb, then standing again, the rain visible as a texture in the sodium light, for 11 minutes and 11 seconds, before walking east and out of frame. 11 minutes is an eternity in a courtroom. It is designed to be. By minute 6, people in that gallery were shifting in their seats, and the prosecutor let it run, because every second of that silence was doing his work for him. His argument, when the lights came up, was 1 sentence long. An honest man does not need 11 minutes. That is what hesitation looks like from behind. Deliberation. A man weighing it. A man deciding. And then the defense called Otis Vandegrift. The prosecution objected before he had fully reached the stand. The objection, cleaned up into the language of the record, was that testimony from a member of an organized criminal enterprise as to the character of a defendant was more prejudicial than probative, that a jury or a judge could not properly weigh the word of a man wearing that patch. The defense's response took about 11 seconds. Your Honor, this witness is not a character witness. He is the complaining party's counterpart. He is the man whose money it was. Overruled. A 61-year-old man, with a knee that had been rebuilt twice, walked to the stand and was sworn, and for the next 20 minutes, that room did not make a sound. He was not eloquent. That is important. He did not give a speech. He answered the questions he was asked in short, flat sentences, and when he got to the part that mattered, he had to stop twice. He testified that the wallet was his, that the amount was $4,200, and that he had counted it in front of 40 people, and every dollar was there. That nobody had contacted him at any point in the 19 days his money was supposedly stolen, and that he had a telephone, and that he would have answered it. Then he was asked what else was in the wallet. A photograph, he said, and a funeral card. He was asked whose, and Otis Vandegrift said his son's name out loud in a courtroom, which people who knew him say he had not done in front of a group of human beings in 11 years. 22 years old. A photograph of the two of them on a fishing dock at a lake in Michigan, both of them holding up the same fish, taken by his wife, who was also gone now. He said there was no other copy. He said he had carried it in that wallet for 11 years, and that he had understood, standing in a parking lot at 5 o'clock that afternoon, that he was never going to see it again. And then he said the thing that people in that gallery still repeat. That boy handed me back the only picture I've got left, and he wouldn't take $1 for it. The prosecutor did not cross-examine. There was nothing there to cross. And then the defense said they had one more piece of evidence, and asked the court's permission to play a second video. Nobody knew it existed. Doc Faraday had found it 8 days earlier by doing the single most obvious thing that no one in law enforcement had bothered to do. She stood in that parking lot and turned in a slow circle and counted every camera that could see it. There were 2. Everyone had pulled the one at 5th and Hollis, mounted high on the brick, angled down and away. The other one was across the street, screwed to the fascia of a family hardware store, aimed out over their own front door to watch for people stealing propane tanks. It caught the parking lot in the upper corner of frame. It was 31 days from being overwritten. The owner handed it over in about 4 minutes and asked if anybody wanted coffee. It was the same 11 minutes. From the front, they dimmed the lights again, and this time the entire room saw a face. They watched a 20-year-old kid stop and go still. They watched him check the corners of that lot and look up at the camera he knew was there. They watched him pick up the wallet and count the money. Once, twice, a third time, and they watched his mouth move while he did it, because he was counting out loud. They watched him put it back, all of it, folded, into the crease, and then he pressed the leather flat with his thumb, and then they watched him find the photograph. He looked at it for 4 minutes, in a courtroom that is an unbearable length of time, and nobody moved. A soaked kid in a jacket too thin for October, sitting down on a wet curb with a stranger's dead son in his hands, and at about the 2-minute mark, plainly and unmistakably, in high enough resolution that there was no arguing about it, he started to cry. He had been in a cell for 19 days, and he had never once mentioned that to anybody. And in the last 30 seconds of that recording, at the very edge of the frame, a black sedan pulls into the lot. It comes in slow, it stops. It does not park in a space. It sits there, engine running, wipers going, for 90 seconds, with a clear line of sight to a young man sitting on a curb in the rain, holding an open wallet. Then it backs up, turns, and pulls out onto Hollis Street. The plate was legible. Doc Faraday had run it 8 days earlier. The vehicle was registered to Kraus Property Group. Delbert Kraus saw the whole thing. He sat 40 feet away with his engine running and watched a homeless kid he had personally evicted, whose grandmother's photograph he had personally thrown into a garbage truck 2 days before, count out $4,200 in the rain, and put every single bill of it back. He watched him do the right thing, and then he drove to a police station and told them a homeless kid had $4,000. If that just made your blood run cold, share this video, right now. Because Delbert Kraus spent 20 years being the most respected man in that county, and the only reason anybody knows what he really was is because people kept telling the story. Send it to one person. That's all I'm asking. If you think men like that shouldn't get to disappear quietly, hit share, and comment, "The camera saw him." The judge did not recess. He sat for a moment with his hand over his mouth, and then he asked the prosecutor whether the state wished to be heard, and the prosecutor stood up and said, quietly, that the state was moving to dismiss both counts, with prejudice. 11:06 in the morning. 23 days after Wendell Pike was arrested on the steps of a library, 4 minutes from a warm room. They brought him out through the front doors, which was somebody's deliberate decision, because there is a side exit, and defendants generally use it, Wendell Pike came out onto the top step of the Ravensburg County Courthouse at about 11:15 in the morning, in a borrowed shirt and a tie he had not tied himself, and stopped. Below him, filling the steps and the sidewalk and both lanes of Main Street and running back 4 blocks past the tire shop, were 350 people and 350 motorcycles, and every single one of them was looking at him. He did not understand what he was looking at. People have described his face, and it was not joy, and it was not relief. It was confusion, the flat, blank confusion of a person whose brain has been handed something it has no category for. He looked behind himself, at the doors, the way you do when you think the thing must be meant for somebody else. Then somebody down on the sidewalk started clapping, and the whole street came apart. The money started with a coffee can. Nobody planned it. There is no version of this story where somebody organized a fundraiser because nobody in that crowd had known how the morning was going to end. A man from a charter out of Kentucky went to the diner on Main, asked the waitress for an empty can, put $200 of his own in it, and started down the line. It filled in under 4 minutes. So somebody took off a jacket and laid it out on the pavement, and that filled. Then a man walked back to his bike and came back with an empty saddlebag, and that is what they used for the rest of it. A leather saddlebag sitting open on the sidewalk in front of the Ravensburg County Courthouse, with 350 people filing past it. 20s, 50s, hundreds. A woman from the Cincinnati Club emptied a checking account at the branch 2 blocks up and came back with $800 in cash. Men who had ridden 4 hours that morning from Pittsburgh and West Virginia to stand in a street for a kid they had never met, put in what they had on them, and then went to find an ATM. It ran about 90 minutes. When Doc Faraday counted it that afternoon at a table in the Iron Kettle, with 3 people watching so it would be done right, it came to just over $41,000. Otis Vandegrift did not put anything in the saddlebag. He had something else. He came up the steps and he put a set of keys in the kid's hand. 2 keys on a ring. One was for a room above a machine shop out on the county road, a real room, with a door that locked, and a bed, and a window. The other was for the shop itself, because the man who owned it was 58 and needed somebody to sweep and haul and eventually learn to run a lathe, and the job started Monday, and an address. An actual address. A street number on a piece of paper, the thing that had been standing between Wendell Pike and every application he'd ever sent from a library computer. When they brought the saddlebag up to him, he tried to refuse it. He got about 4 words out. The same 4 words. It's not mine. Before Otis put a hand flat on his chest and stopped him. Your grandmother told you what you find isn't yours, he said. She's right. She was right about that, and don't you ever let go of it. But this ain't found, son. This is given. There's a difference, and you're gonna have to learn it. Wendell Pike sat down on the courthouse steps. Not in the alley, when the truck took his grandmother's picture. Not in the holding cell, across 19 days that nobody knew he was living through. Not in that courtroom, watching 400 strangers see him cry on a screen. Here, on a cold step, in a borrowed shirt, with a set of keys in one hand, and 350 people standing in the street. He put his head down and he broke, and he did not stop for a long time. And nobody in that crowd said one word or moved to touch him. They just closed in a little and stood around him, and let a 20-year-old boy fall apart in public where it was safe. Follow every details above in a flowing documentary narration style. No mention of timestamps and scripts. No cuts, no splits, no visuals. Just pure narration, 600 words. Don't jump into or share details of the next scene until asked to do so. Wendell Pike swept that machine shop floor for 4 months before anybody let him touch a lathe. He finished the diesel program he'd walked away from at 19. He is certified now, and has been for years, and he works on trucks, the big ones, the long-haul rigs that come off Route 9, and he is apparently very good at it in the specific way that people are good at things they had to fight to get back. He has an apartment, 1 bedroom, 2nd floor, his name on the lease. He signed that lease himself, and he has said that he read every line of it twice, and that he keeps a copy in a drawer. Once a year, in the fall, he speaks at a fundraiser for the shelter in Marysburg, the one that had a bed for him in February and none in March. He is not a natural at it. He keeps it short. He mostly just tells people what it is like to apply for a job with no address. Otis Vandegrift is still riding. The knee is worse and he does not care, and the charter has stopped arguing with him about it. The photograph is not in his wallet anymore. It is in a frame, on a shelf, in a house, where a thing like that ought to be. He had a copy made. He gave it to Wendell. And on the second Sunday of every month, at a diner out on Route 9, a mechanic in his 30s and a man in his 70s have breakfast together. Same booth. She brings the coffee before they order. That 12th job application, the one still open on a library computer the day everything changed, was never sent. Wendell never went back for it. He didn't need to. Somebody had already decided he was worth more than a form. 350 people rode hundreds of miles for a young man that most of that town had walked past for 8 months without seeing. They didn't do it because he was special. He wasn't. He was a hungry kid in boots that didn't fit, who had every reason in the world to keep that money, and not one person alive who would have known. They did it because he was honest, when being honest cost him everything, and because somebody finally decided that ought to count for something. Delbert Krauss was one man. He built a whole life out of counting on the fact that nobody would stand up. He was wrong. So, if you're the kind of person who stands up, subscribe. Comment "I'd have ridden" if you'd have been on Route 9 that morning, and I'll see you in the next one.